Hello, and welcome to 2024 Data and Analytics Trends and Predictions. Today's webinar is sponsored by Dremio and produced by ActualTech Media. My name is Scottbekker. I'm from ActualTech, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Let's get to today's fantastic session. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today. We have Read Maloney, who's Chief Marketing Officer for Dremio. So Read, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and for everyone attending, you know what we're really striving to do is to help everybody as they're entering their new years and look at their budgets and their planning to help benchmark against their peers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Dremio and our data lakehouse and how that fits in, and we're also going to talk about the major trends that we're seeing in the market and what we're heard from 500 different individuals that we went out to go do. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the survey in a moment, but it's done by a third party. This is not just done to Dremio customers. It's to get a broad market view. We have customers that are enterprises that fill it out, and that's a pretty high percentage of the overall population. And then we have some that are more in the mid-market space. And then we have a range of professionals from more senior data leaders into data professionals who are working actually hands-on with the data day-to-day. So we sort of have a broad portfolio of what we looked at. And the whole set is we want you guys to walk away with, hey, these are some things I might want to consider into your initiatives or roadmap for the year. And, you know, some of the technologies you might want to incorporate into that in terms of driving change in your organizations. So with that, you know, one of the things we continue to hear from customers over and over again is they're on these journeys where they're really trying to improve the amount of questions that are being asked and answered using data in the organization. And it's really that data-driven culture, data-driven organization push that's been following digitization, so digital transformation, and now obviously AI transformation. And then part of that is as they're getting more people hands-on, they need those insights to come very quickly. So if they're sitting there and say, I can't find the data I need, how do I create the view that I actually want to query, and so forth, that then they have to talk to specialized resources and, you know, data engineering teams that might be many levels removed. They sit in a queue, and it's very hard to actually ever answer the question. And by the time the review comes with their exec or what they're ever trying to do, they're already past that timeline. And so it's really important for them to lower their mean time to insight. And then obviously, as queries are going up, and they're trying to encourage more self-service to lower these mean times to insight, that puts a lot of pressure on the system, which can lead to a lot of costs. It can cause scales problems, et cetera. So their nirvana is being able to do all of these. And then, of course, doing that in a situation where the data is governed and there's no security breaches on what's going on. And so, yeah, it's a lot to manage in terms of, and this is a very common challenge set where we're trying to increase adoption and move faster, and we're trying to still manage governance and security and costs, almost competing priorities. And it's like, how do you get the best of both worlds? And we'll talk to you a little bit about how we're seeing that happen. And right now, the main obstacle that we see in these two worlds joining them in is just really complex data pipelines. That they're brittle. They end up just creating a ton of pressure in the system, meaning every time you want to make a change, you're going in and getting specialized resources. They have to unpack code that might have been written a long time ago, figure out how the pipeline was written. Some things are still moving data in, and there's not clear ownership. How do you go about this? And so, you know, the data is going from multiple sources, and we'll talk to you about the average number of sources we saw in our survey. And as you can imagine, in big companies, it gets really high. Those are funneling often now into a data lake. Those lakes are then you're getting transformations from the data that's landing raw in the lake into a warehouse. From a warehouse, you're seeing extracts and cubes and everything to manage performance into these client-side tools. And it basically just turns into spaghetti soup going from source all the way to where you're actually getting the insight with the client. And so this is where the lake houses come in, right? So part of what we're going to talk about in terms of trends today is the trend to lake houses. And why is that? Well, you start to shift left. And when we say shift left, what we're saying is you're getting the actual consumer of the data, you're getting them closer to the source. And so with the lake house, you're really removing the warehouse in the system. So that whole extra set of spaghetti soup where you're saying, look, I'm getting stuff now, ETL pipelines from my source into the lake house. I can now actually move the clients directly onto the lakehouse. I'm getting the performance of a warehouse directly on my lake. I've now simplified my architecture, and that's reducing a lot of cost. It's reducing complexity in terms of the steps managed to actually get data to the user for insights. And so you're actually in the end improving uptime too, because there's less steps when something goes wrong in terms of going and orchestrating that backfill. And so we're seeing a lot of this. You'll see later like how much adoption is now already going into the lakehouse. It's faster than what we expected in terms of our survey responses. And so this is the driver right here. It's complex, brittle pipelines, and they're overall able to simplify their architecture and deliver data to the customers faster. But the one thing we'll call out is they're great, but they don't necessarily enable self-service. In the end, for the most part, you're still going back. The business users are saying, or the analysts are saying, hey, I want this view. I need it to look like this. They're having to go to a specialized resource to go create that and create the pipeline to serve that. And then you're sort of back into, well, you're bottlenecking. And so you have engineers who want to work on higher value projects to drive the business, but they're working on these mundane tasks from the business. So there's got to be a way that this works a bit better. And so this is what we've been focused on at Dremio, which is, again, how do we shift even farther left? How do we get the consumers closer to the data? And so there's three components that we think every team needs from a technology perspective, which is you need a fast and intelligent query engine. And I'll tell you what we mean when we talk about an intelligent query engine. You need an intuitive self-serve experience for the SQL analyst. And then you need next generation data ops capabilities to ensure that when you're setting up a pipeline, you're not consistently going back and troubleshooting it and having to put in all this maintenance time and so forth. It's more, you're going to build it and you're going to be able to make it really simple to build, but also really simple to maintain. And that's what we're bringing at Dremio. To talk about this just a little bit in terms of shifting left, and I'll just provide a simple example here. Let's say you have your data source, and in this particular chart right here, you have the purple are physical tables and the green are views. Okay, and what ends up happening is you're going to bring in the source data, and those are your physical tables here. In this case, voter survey data and voter data. And then in this example, you're bringing that together into a view that is enriched voter data, and then you end up having Ohio voters as a view on top of a view, and Illinois voters on a view on the top of a view. And the good thing for the consumer, right, is they're like, okay, I have the data I need to play with. I can create the views. I can start moving quickly. But now when I write the query, I'm having to basically create the views, right? I'm doing schema on read. So I'm creating the views, and that calls another view, and I'm end up doing like full table scans, and I'm putting a lot of load on the system. Okay, and this is why in a lot of cases where you're enabling self-service, you got to go back to the engineer, and the engineer now needs to build a materialized view. And in that materialization of the view, I got to rewrite the SQL, right? So I'm rewriting the SQL to the dashboard, and in the end, I don't really have self-service because to really get this type of experience, I'm continually going back into the engineering team, and they're like, okay, I'm just overwhelmed with these basic requests, which we don't want. So we have this technology called reflections, where we will actually look at hotspots in the data and say, hey, this is where we recommend that you should have a materialization of the view. But what's really unique is that as you create the materialization, our query engine's aware of it. And so our query engine will rewrite the SQL on the fly automatically. So the business user sits there and they just query their view. But under the covers, we're actually rewriting the SQL to take advantage of the materialization. And so this allows the engineering team to very simply manage and optimize performance, whereas the business teams can go off and just run and create the views. And even if they're stacking views, that's no problem. They're just querying the views directly, setting up dashboards, whereas you're just then on the engineering side ensuring that you're materializing the views that you need to, and the query engine's taking care of the rest. And that's what we mean when we talk about an intelligent query engine. Okay, so into that construct, like we're going to talk about the survey that is going to be involved in Lakehouse first. Then we're going to talk about data, open table formats, obviously critical to Lakehouse, and the adoption that we're seeing there, and sort of how the formats are evolving, and sort of adoption between the formats. We'll talk about data mesh. specifically, and I know data mesh is still a very jargony term. It's been clearly defined in terms of the 4 pillars, but we'll talk. A lot of what we see is how is that, like, why is it so important in organizations? And they may talk about it in different ways, like self-service, for example, which is one of the pillars. So we'll dive into like why, where organizations are pushing the boundary there, and then we'll talk about AI. So we're going to cover those 4 areas next. Again, 500 different practitioners across a range of organizations. It's commissioned by a third party, which I covered earlier, but making sure people who joined a few minutes late, they're aware of that. This is not to Dremio's customers. Okay, so data lakehouse awareness. So again, this is the first year we've done this survey, and we do anticipate to keep doing this. If you have questions that would be valuable for us to answer for you on a yearly basis, please do let us know. Please ping us, and we'll continue to incorporate that. But we know that from other surveys that were done from other analyst institutions, that awareness last year was much lower than this. And so to see that 85% are very familiar with the concept of a lakehouse speaks to the fact that it must be creating a lot of value in the market. And I have an adoption slide next talking about planned adoption, and you'll see just how fast the lakehouse is growing right now. And that's based on value. So we'll talk about some of the value drivers in a few slides about why people are moving to the lakehouse and why this is happening so fast. When we talk about a lakehouse, again, we're talking about something that combines the performance, functionality, and governance of a warehouse with the scalability and cost advantages of a data lake. And that's the term that people are familiar with. With lakehouse adoption, says 69% feel the lakehouse will be the primary way they deliver analytics in their organizations in the next 3 years. Okay. It is my bet that we actually cross the 50% threshold this year. So I think what you'll end up seeing is that more than half of organizations the lakehouse becomes the primary way they're delivering analytics by the end of this year. And if you think about where things were with a data lake and what analytics was being done on a lake, which was generally relatively minimal by using query engines such as Hive, where you had all these performance challenges, and then again, the need for the warehouse in the middle, the shift to the lakehouse has just happened so quickly that we've been really surprised by, we understand that this is where our company is based, but we've been surprised by just how fast it's happening in the market right now. So the whole group says 70% are going to be there in the next 3 years from an analytics perspective. And so what's driving that? And so there are a variety of reasons. And if you go down all of our report, right, it's in the handout section, you can see all the reasons that they have across all the percentages. But one of the main ones is cost, right? Like you have old, we'll say legacy enterprise data warehouse systems such as Teradata that people have been trying to get off because of cost. And then you've had a lot of them move into cloud data warehouses. And those cloud data warehouses have sort of ended up being Teradata in the cloud with now have massive rising costs. And so when you look at the lakehouse and you're saying, well, now I have open data, it's an open table format. I basically have way more, I can't be held hostage by my data anymore. It's a much more efficient model. We already talked about you're eliminating an entire step in your brittle pipeline. So that's another TCO element. So more than 50% think they're saving 50%, with 20% thinking it's a 76+% savings. And I can tell you, based on the customers we keep acquiring and growing as a business, that this is absolutely the case, and that we generally see well more than 50% TCO when customers are moving from their current environments to something like the Dremio Lakehouse. And so where's that data coming from? And we just talked about this in terms of some of the systems out there that are quite expensive in terms of warehousing today. You have cloud data warehouses and you have enterprise data warehouses, and then you also have data lakes. And to be honest, I thought, from an adoption standpoint, you'd be like, okay, well, the data's already in a lake. we can make these improvements by adopting an open table format and a high performance query engine such as Dremio, and we can basically turn our lake into a lakehouse. That would be where most of the data is coming from. And it turns out that that's not the case. Part of that's probably from just volume of data in terms of where the data is the most usable is happening today. But I think part of that's also cost, right? If you go and you look at the cost of the cloud data warehouse houses that are out in the market, and you look at the enterprise data warehouses that are out in the market, they're really expensive in comparison to moving to a lakehouse environment. And so people are moving that data, even though in some cases they just went from something like Teradata to Snowflake, they're already moving it to a lakehouse. And a lot of that pain, as we talked about from the survey, that's cost related. And so we ended up doing a total cost of ownership, where we're comparing the like price performance, for example, between doing this on a lakehouse or doing it on Snowflake, and other elements that are involved in terms of needing the data engineers to continue to do more ETL specifically into the warehouse and manage that process versus just going straight to the lake and have this report. It's also in the handout. So if you click over in the handout, we have all the details about this. The price performance is done off the TCP/DS benchmark. So we're using like standard benchmarks. And all the performance we did is raw. So I talked about that query acceleration technology where we will materialize the view and then we will actually rewrite the SQL on the fly. We did not use that in this case because Snowflake doesn't have that. And so we tried to keep it as apples to apples as possible in the comparison. So here's a scenario for you to look at. But this is just one of the places where a lot of the data is coming into a lakehouse environment such as Dremio. Okay, open table format. So look, if you have a lake and you don't have an open table format, you certainly you don't have a lakehouse. And so what's happening here? So number one is about 56% have adopted an open table format with planned adoption of about 91%. So if you look at 55.6%, which have, and then you look at no, but they're planning to in a year, and then no, but planning to in 3 years, and you add that up, what's that telling you? It's basically saying everybody plans to adopt an open table format except for this like small sliver who's saying, look, the way we're doing it's fine. We have no plans to move to a lakehouse. So this is also data that's showing how fast things are moving to the lakehouse, and that almost every organization is planning to move to a lakehouse for at least some portion of their analytics over time. So that's just been, that's obvious. That's where we think the market is going and where we thought it was going to go. And that's where it's ending up right now. Okay. So 56%, but a lot more adoptions happening this year. That means a lot of people on the call here, you guys have already adopted a table format and you might be looking to switch it. We'll talk about that. But then we also are saying, like, if you haven't, the next major chunk is actually happening next year. Okay. So one of the things that's happened in the format space is that Delta Lake was out there first, and it has the most adoption in the market. But Apache Iceberg is the fastest growing. So if you look at planned adoption, more of that is going to Iceberg. And so I actually wrote a blog on what I think the top bold claims for 24 are. I personally believe, and I don't have the data to back this up, just to be fair, this is not in the survey data. This is Read Maloney saying, here's what I think is going to happen. I think Apache Iceberg is going to pass Delta Lake this year. I think it's going to be the most adopted format in the market by the end of the year. So we put a poll out on our LinkedIn through social media, and we basically said, like, do you agree with this claim or not? And 75% of people responded saying they agree with the claim. Now, that's off of our posts, versus that's out to like a broad range of third parties. But I think there's this absolute trend going towards Apache Iceberg. And that aligns with what we've invested in as a company, where we support both Delta Lake and Iceberg from a read format. But when you're doing we'll say a complete lakehouse and all the write operations, DML, et cetera, all of that for us is investment in Iceberg. And the reason we did that wasn't because we care about one format versus the other. It's, which format did we feel like was going to be the open format? And so when we looked at the ecosystems that we're developing, we looked at Iceberg, and it's the Apache project, Apache Iceberg, whereas Delta Lake was the Databricks project. And we said, no, we think Iceberg is going to become the open standard. And so our investment in that direction was just because we think it's going to be the open standard. What's really interesting, and this is data pulled from GitHub, is that if you look at the 90% of attributable contributions for Iceberg, that's coming from 15 different companies, including large tech companies like Adobe, Netflix, and Apple. And so it's a much broader set that's contributing to the project, whereas there's 90% of Delta Lake is still coming from Databricks. Okay, and so we really see these forking, and that Iceberg has continued to evolve, and the ecosystem development around it's much stronger because it's being viewed as the open table format. Whereas, on the Databricks side, for example, they're only letting you write into Delta Lake. They're not supporting Iceberg, and that's a very closed mindset. Again, we're sort of going back into, well, if you're a closed lakehouse, you're really just a proprietary warehouse in that case again. And that's not what we've heard from customers in terms of what they're looking for, to have the architectural flexibility to serve their businesses. Okay, on to data mesh. So this one was a little bit interesting for me. So when we went out and I asked all these companies, like, have you fully adopted data mesh? Like, what's your level of implementation look like? 84% said they're fully or partially implemented. That's the 50.2% on the right and the 34.1% you see in the slide. Okay. And I could understand 84% being partially implemented because there's 4 major pillars of data mesh. And like one of the pillars we see with our customers, that's probably that they're all still working on is, how am I going to govern in a decentralized manner? Right, which is one of the pillars. And so when I see 50% fully implemented, I have to imagine that's more about they've adopted the philosophy of data mesh completely from a data team perspective. But based on the conversations I have with customers and that I have with specific data engineers, I have not seen that level in the market myself. So this was surprising data. I'm just presenting to you guys what it is. And you can take that for what it's worth into your organizations. But I want to call out that we have a lot of our customers are thinking about, have adopted the data mesh principles as a way to say we want to be able to move fast, and we know we need to move to a level of decentralization to do that. Okay, but we also want to make sure we have strong governance controls in place and really understand ownership from a data product perspective. And I think a lot of people are on that journey. And so if you go into the report, 96% say they continue to plan to implement data mesh next year. That just shows you how high a percentage of the group has at least data mesh thinking or concepts into what they're trying to bring to their business. But what I couldn't reconcile is how can 96% feel like they're continuing to implement data mesh when 50% say they're fully implemented. So we were sort of looking at that data and say, we generally believe this is probably, people are answering this question more from a philosophical perspective. And so I think the takeaway there is companies are interpreting what's right for them from these data mesh principles in different ways. Okay, so like there's not a one size fits all approach to say this is exactly the way to do it. But that we do think that almost every company is trying to bridge these worlds of, I want the business to use more data and get the insights faster. And at the same time, I want that data to be secure and governed. And they are using data mesh principles as a way to reconcile these often opposing forces. So I think that's the takeaway for the group. And then each organization obviously needs to look at, what's the right starting point to get involved in that. And I think what we see is we tend to see an evolution where people go to self-service as a principle first, and then they start to move into data products. And with data products, they start to move to, okay, how do I deal with federated governance? And there's sort of this journey into data mesh that tends to follow that arc. Okay. Another reason for data mesh is really related to data fabric, which is joining and federating queries across multiple sources, which is required if you want to do self-service. I'm obviously on the marketing side, and my team uses data extensively, and we get data from multiple sources. And you can think of that as like our CRM and our web analytics and our product, and bridging that together to make sure we know how to do our jobs to the best of our ability, and getting those sources to work. Again, we drink our own champagne. We use a Dremio Lakehouse to do our own analytics, is really critical for us. And the environment in a lakehouse is very flexible, in terms of being able to have the data in, create views, and be able to query those is really great for us. And so when we looked at our companies, we have over 10%, almost 11% of respondents actually had 100 plus sources that they're dealing with. And so if you're trying to go and say, look, we want to have a platform, we want to try to govern this across all these different data sources while still getting the data to the business, you need tools that are going to be able to help bridge that, to help the customers find the data they need quickly and to be able to move fast. And so on average, you're seeing, the median here is 21. Right, 50% plus have 21 data sources or more. So that's really where, in the way we ask the question, the median sits in terms of the sources that organizations are dealing with. The next thing I think is really interesting is, the largest chunk, if you guys look at the slide, it says 35.7% are coming from the central data platform team in terms of who's driving data mesh in an organization. Okay, and that's great, but if you start looking at specifically the line of business, either the line of business data teams or the line of business actual leaders, you're seeing that be a higher percentage. So the lines of business are really interested in data mesh, and that's not a surprise to me in terms of, they're like, look, I need the data I need when I need it, that's access, and then I need to be able to move quickly to get the insights I need. So that is one of the we sort of expected this, but I'm not sure I knew that line of business was going to be over the central data teams. But what's I think even more interesting is if you look at the CEO and the digital transformation office, both approach this from the business construct, and then you have the lines of business. Actually, 2/3 of the overall drivers of data mesh are coming from the business. And so, at Dremio, we do work a lot with central data platform teams, and I would say most of the ones that are working with us are very have a mindset of like, how am I going to drive the business forward, and are being very successful in that case. So I think a lot of these central data platform leaders who are picking up the concept of data mesh and driving it can actually get ahead of what's going to happen in terms of what's coming from the business, and help to push the architectures that are going to allow them to still maintain, still lower costs, maintain governance, but also allow much greater access and speed within the business, are being really successful. And obviously, what we see is how that's helping their careers out as part of that. Okay, this one was a bit of a surprise to me when I looked at it, because I did expect, based on the data we were going through and looking at the line of business and the business drivers, and obviously self-service being a core element of data mesh, what would be the top objective? I would have been like, okay, well, that's clearly something around either data access, which is 55%, that's number 2 on the chart, or the agility time to insight, 47%. So those are both, relatively, they're on the chart, but they're not the top. The top was data quality. And then the number 2 is data governance. And so even within the construct of this being like, hey, how do we move faster? How do we go? Quality and governance were the number 1 and 2 drivers for data mesh. And we thought about like, well, why do we think that's happening? Like, why do we think that's the response? And part of it is that we believe that if the business is not getting access to the data they want, then they're going out and they're grabbing things and they're merging them together in Excel, or they're going out, maybe they're grabbing SQL Server or some other type of cloud data warehouse, and they're throwing things in it and they're running, and it's not governed. And so that we see this to say, look, in a data mesh environment, what are we able to do? You're able to say, look, from a data products perspective, we have ownership. We're ensuring that the data coming in is of higher quality, and then we're able to govern the access to that to those data products within the lines of business. But we're also providing the speed and insight, so they're actually using the platform the way it's intended. They're not creating data copies. They're not creating data proliferation types of problems. And so, in the end, by enabling the business to move faster, you're actually getting data quality, data governance thing. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that. This was something that I know data quality is a massive thing going on, especially with all the adoption of AI. So your data is not high quality. You can get all kinds of problems if you start building models off of that data, and then those are your production models making decisions for your organization. So I understand I understand why data quality is so high, but I'm not sure I understand why it's so high just in the relation to why data mesh. And so if you have thoughts on that, I'd love for you guys to share them. Right now you can ask questions, you can put in as a comment, but I think that'd be very interesting for the group. So one of the things we've done here, and this is specific to helping to manage data and improve data quality, and this is related to the pillar of data products for data mesh, which is we have something that we call Get Inspired Data Version Control. And so you can take your main branch of data. So this is what we'd say for your data product. This is the production data set that the business users are working off of. They're creating views off of it and they're querying their views, but this is the actual data product. You can branch that product, and this is not a copy. Okay, this is a pointer. It points back to the main data. And then you can ingest the data in, and then you can run the data quality checks. You can do those with your own scripts or tools like Monte Carlo. And then you can say, okay, yes, this passed the checks, and now I'm going to merge it back, and then it versions. So if you were on version 1, you could call that next version V11, or maybe that's V2. And so you know that data has been checked and is ready. And if it fails the check, you can go straight back to, hey, well, I know that came in from events ETL 71323. Let's go see what happened there. And now your time troubleshooting is minimized. You're not getting all the way down to then your business user saying, hey, I look at this data every day, now I have a problem. Now you're going back and you're troubleshooting on every step back in the pipeline. And then you're having to, once you finally figure that out, go and do the backfill. And so we believe this is going to really help teams in terms of improve the data quality that they're offering to the business. And it's also going to really reduce the amount of time they're spending doing these, we'll say, not fun tasks in terms of troubleshooting and backfilling data, because you will have caught it earlier and it'll be a lot easier to tell what's going on in the pipeline. But the other big advantage is on data science. So again, I can, instead of having to create an entire physical set and branch over to go start exploring the data and do feature engineering, I can just create I can just create a branch off of the main. I can go work on that. I can add data into it, and I can go work on that. I can do my feature engineering. Once I have the features, if I'm happy with them, I could put those back into the lake, and then I can kill the branch. Or if I'm not, I can just kill the branch and restart that. And so it enables a lot of flexibility on the data science side from an experimentation perspective. Okay, and the last topic is that we're going to cover today is AI. And so AI in the data lakehouse, this is probably not a surprise to anybody, which is 81% of customers are using a lakehouse for AI. And this generally goes along with data lakes often being used heavily for AI because they can deal with any type of data. Right. So we're dealing with structured, semi-structured, unstructured data. You're able to put that together. You're able to then explore, experiment, and pull everything. So that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of all the data coming together. In some ways, I'm surprised it's not even more. I think that probably just shows there's some of the respondents out there that either aren't aware that their teams are doing, that their lakehouse is being used for AI. or it's, maybe the business just isn't at that level of maturity yet, depending on who the respondent was. The other thing that I've seen is that now on average, the respondents are saying they have 30 AI models. This is per organization, 30 AI models in production right now. And so that is, what I think's happened is when I was working at H2O.ai, the average was you had to build 12, 15 models before one of those experimental models went into production. And the biggest holdup there when I talked to our customers was like, look, there's this bridging between the business problem and the AI team. And how do they get the requirements set to ensure they're working on things that drive business value? I've definitely been handed models in the past before that says, hey, here's a model for you. But it couldn't be explained to me, and then it couldn't be explained to my stakeholders in a way that made it usable. And that was often an issue with where models weren't being adopted. I think that happened often a lot in software development initially too. People just thought, oh, I'm going to build this thing. It's really cool, but it wasn't actually usable to the person who gained value from it. I think that's already now changing. I think you're seeing a lot more of where the business knows how to work with their AI teams, and they're able to say, hey, here's the problems I'm trying to solve. They come back and say, oh yeah, that's, here's a way to approach that. They're bringing them back coefficients. They're bringing them back SHAP values. They're able to say, okay, here's how I would explain this to you. And then that's enabling more models to go into production. And so this to me is a growth from what I had seen before. And I believe we're going to continue to see, growth moving forward. All right, couple things on getting started, and then we'll go see what questions we have left in the session. Is when we summarize what we see most customers trying to do is they're trying to improve data adoption and reduce their mean time to insight while also lowering their costs. And that's going to happen by shifting left, right? How do you get the data consumers closer to the actual source data? And how do you do so in a governed manner? And we see that, customers need three things to do that. They need an intelligent query engine that's going to allow the engineers to manage system performance and keep everything running really well while the business is off running, creating the views they need and querying those views to get the insights they need without bogging down the system. So SQL analysts do what they need, engineers do what they need, and they don't have to have a direct communication rewriting every single SQL query all the time. You have to have an intuitive self-service experience so that the analysts can come in and they can be really successful within that platform in terms of creating the views and querying the views. And you need to be able to have a next-gen data ops capability so that you can create these, you can really easily create these data products. They're simple to create, they're streamlined and automated to manage, and then they're really easy to govern. And all of those things factor into being able to shift left. In terms of getting started specifically with Dremio, you can use a QR code and go straight to our landing page if you want. You also have it in the handout. And then we have free versions of our software and our cloud. So you can either go and download our software and get started. We have a lot of companies that try us out on just their laptop to get going before they would create a server cluster and try that out. Or they just get started with our cloud and they can easily connect into the data sources they have, their data lakes like S3 and ADLS. And just get started experimenting with the product. There is not a time limit or anything like that on the cloud. You just connect your cloud resources in, and you can start using the technology. All right, with that, we're gonna look at some questions.
All right, awesome. Yeah, a great presentation, Reed. And Reed, you went through a lot of really interesting results from the survey, but just to redirect a little bit, what do you think the most important takeaways were from that study?
Well, I think that one of the biggest ones is that the speed of adoption right now, based off of honestly value creation. So if organizations have been waffling on, hey, we have this way we're doing it and it sort of works, I think what you would look at that is say, well, most of the organizations are not staying pat. Like they are changing, and they're changing into lakehouse environments. One of the main drivers being cost for that, and they're changing into data mesh architectures. And obviously one of the main drivers there is data quality, but also to help the business self-serve and move more quickly. So I'd say that the trying to just optimize within what you have is not what the market's doing right now. The market is looking different architectures to, honestly, it goes back to the crazy brittle pipelines. They're trying to get more adoption while lowering costs, and that just fundamentally isn't going to work with some of the legacy technologies that are out there.
Gotcha. So one of the things you kind of put out a call out there for data quality comments about when you said that Angie put in a question, asked, for me, governance is huge when dealing with my customer base, dealing with regulated data primarily. Can you speak to how data lakes handle security of data?
Yeah, so there's two. I mean, when you get into a data lake, there's a range of different owners from a security perspective. And so number one, a couple of things for us, like we have large, highly regulated customers such as like TransUnion and JPMC that are using Dremio today. So we're really familiar in working with customers in terms of being able to have their data in a lakehouse environment, have it governed, and allow them to get, again, move more quickly and get a lot of value from their data. Okay. What we're specifically going to do in that case is we have fine-grained access controls. So this is role-based, and you can go in and do row and column level masking, and you can set those across all the data sources that are within Dremio. We also integrate with partners such as Privacera, so you can apply governance policies that would work across all of the different groups that you would have that are using the lakehouse. And then in addition to that, we have this concept called spaces that in the data mesh term they call domains. So you can actually go and create and say, hey, for this line of business, and then let's call that consumer banking. And then let's say that it's the marketing department of consumer banking, right? You can create these spaces. We call them spaces. And so then you have people in spaces. You can give access to data within the spaces. That's basically where you would have data products that are specifically for spaces. So that's how that piece fits together. Okay. The next part of that I think is helpful is what I was talking about with Get Inspired Data Version Control, which is now from a versioning perspective, you have ability to go back and say, what was the data? This is time travel. And then you can also do time travel with lineage. That's all baked into Dremio's platform. That's governance, though, and I think the question is more around, might have been more around security. And so, I'm going to use, I'll use AWS as an example with S3. AWS will always talk about there's security in the cloud and there's security of the cloud. And that's the shared responsibility model. And so AWS specifically on their data lake, they have a set of security there's a set of secure, I'm trying to think of the right word to say it. There are security controls. That's the word I'm looking for. They have a set of security controls that they manage on behalf of the customer. But then, right, there's a whole set of access controls even in that then the customer manages. So the customer gets the tools where they can encrypt the data, they can land it and encrypt it at rest. So we don't do that. Right, from a Dremio perspective, we're not sitting there and saying we're encrypting your data. You would go and land the data and encrypt it. But when we are dealing with your data that is encrypted, we that's no problem. And then anytime we're taking data in, we can deal with data. We can transfer like HTTPS, like we can transfer encrypted data. So we deal with everything as much as possible from a security first mindset at Dremio. And so do the cloud providers that we work with, but there's still a set of tools that the customer manages in terms of how they want to set and secure and govern that data. So
Okay.
just like how the cloud has shared ownership, we have the tools for you to govern it. But if you don't, if you just open up all the tools, then it's open. So you still have to set those policies. We don't set them on your behalf.
Gotcha. All right. Angie, thanks for the question. Next one here comes from Saul, who's wondering, is it possible for Dremio to build data consistency checks that change over time and involve with data nature?
I take it that the data consistency checks is related to data quality checks and sort of the whole field of data observability. Now, the way we're going to help with that again is through Git inspired data version control. Okay, where you're going to create a branch and then run the checks, but those checks we don't do for you. Meaning, in our platform, we are not like a data observability platform like Monte Carlo. Okay, so you would create those scripts yourself in terms of running that to do the checks, or you would use a tool like, again, I'll use again Monte Carlo, like Monte Carlo to go do that, and so it's an area that we know customers care about, and we have ways to work with them to set that up with the platforms they want to use. And I think our unique ability to, again, branch and version and manage data makes this great for customers, but we're not a data observability platform. Like we do the basic, like we do lineage and time travel like I talked about, but there's capabilities within the tools that specifically focus on that are beyond what we do.
Okay. All right. Great. Saul, thanks for the question. Next question here comes from Paul. I was wondering, to what extent does rapidly evolving AI models represent an opportunity or a difficult challenge with data analytics at scale?
Rapidly evolving. I wish this is like where a chat would happen. My sense is that this is related to drift. This is going to be my guess, is that we're talking about model drift. So like,
Gotcha.
I don't know that the challenges are that different from just AI model development than even rapidly changing ones, but it's going to go back to, do you trust the source data coming in, and do you believe the data that you're modeling off of is accurate? With RAG now and sort of the whole concept of like ensuring that you're getting the most accurate data as you're getting a prediction. It sort of goes back to data quality on that too. If you're trying to get data in to make that prediction in real time, and that data is not trusted, you have a problem. So yeah, there's massive data challenges associated with that, but I think most of them are related to data quality. You could end up in we have this massive amount of data that needs to come in and needs to process and then needs to retrain, and you're dealing with maybe a system where you have like daily retraining, which is possible. And then you're just dealing with scale challenges. But I'd say like in the market by and large, in a lot of the scale out systems, like ours for SQL, for example, and others that Spark, for example, and Python, like you can generally get through that knot hole by just adding more compute resources to make that work, and that you're still going to be left back with just a data quality type of challenge. Again, versioning super important here, right? So what do companies want to do? I have model version V1. I want to be able to map that to data version V1. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to go to the next version of my data, and let's say I'm retraining directly on that next version as it comes in. Now I have data version V2 aligned to model version V2. You can imagine how much this helps with AI governance. So that's a specific way that we're trying to help the market out in terms of data quality as it relates to machine learning and AI.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Paul. Next question comes from Peter. Who's asking, how do you address challenges related to data synchronization and consistency across multiple data sources?
Well, we actually have a few ways to do that. Well, one of which is because at Dremio, and I don't know if you saw this earlier, where we talk about like the number of sources organizations have. We connect to all the major data sources that are out there, and so we will federate the query. And so in some, if you don't want to move the data and it's in a system, you're just querying it directly from the source. And so in that case, you've already solved a consistency issue. If you're bringing it in to the lake and you're doing it from a lakehouse perspective, with open table formats like Iceberg, you have the concept of ACID transactions. And so that is a way for you to understand, I'm not saying that it's synced up exactly with what your source is. That's going to deal with your ETL pipeline, right? Like, what's your job set up and when does it come in? But once it comes in, if you're landing that in an Iceberg format, so let's say I'm pulling from Oracle and I'm pulling one of the objects from an Oracle database, and I'm going to land that in the lake. Okay, and I'm just basically doing a raw pull, but I'm doing an Iceberg transformation. I'm going to go grab that. I'm going to transform into Iceberg. By the way, you can do this with copy into with Dremio. You can then land that in Iceberg, and then you have consistency within that source as it lands. And so what ends up happening is you have that source, and then you have another source, right, that we talked about. Those are physical loads, and then you're basically creating often what is the data model or the data product for that line of business or the group that's being supported. Your consistency would happen from, in our case, you can version both of these to know that new data came in. And then your job would be set up to say, I want to make sure I'm using this version, 2.23, and this version 2.24, knowing that they landed. And when that happens, run this job. And the next job would be the next part of your pipeline. And a lot of this orchestration in this next step would happen through dbt. And then they go and you're going to create your data product at that point. Okay. And so we don't do anything initially to say, like, in our platform that says check for this version and then check for this version. And if you see those two versions land back into the main, again, this is automation related to data ops right now, then kick off this job with dbt. All right. That's something you would end up having to orchestrate. And then, we would be supporting that from a version control perspective.
Gotcha. Okay, excellent. Thanks for the question, Peter. Probably got time for one more question here, and Ned is kind of wondering what you're hearing from CEOs and other senior executives. What are the top initiatives you see data teams focusing on for 2024, and do you think they're the right ones?
Well, I'm going to answer that in two ways. Number one is, if you go to our site, like we did an event with Mike Ferguson, who's a analyst in the space, well-known analyst in the space, and with Mark Sear, who leads the data platform for Maersk, which is one of, if not the largest shipping company in the world. And so all that content, you don't need to fill out a form or anything. We made it all just available on our site. And so you're going to, in that one, if you go into Mark's session on data as a force multiplier, which is the last one, he talks about this directly, so you can get his voice from it. And then there's a panel that's part of that. We have it all chapterized, and you can just go into the panel on the video there, and they also discuss this outside of it. Clearly, AI is one of them, right? Like there's no senior executive right now that's not thinking about, and this is actually related to generative AI more than machine learning. Like machine learning's been out. I think there's been more adoption. You saw like there's 30 models in production, but I think what senior executives are thinking about and worried about are how big a change is this going to drive? I think a lot of them are trying to think about not just like what could I do with it today, but like how is this fundamentally going to change roles and talent and how I run my business overall. Like they're really thinking about how is the entire industry going to change right now, and as that's related, and then that relates to, do I then have the data structure and platforms that are going to enable us to compete as those business units evolve? So like this is a much larger sort of overall trend. I think if you go and you look relatively short into this one right now, there's still a ton of digital transformation happening within most industries and most companies. And related to that in terms of, I would say like we're starting to see economic conditions be more certain with the Fed signaling interest rate decreases. And a lot of that then pulls back into tech and moving forward in tech and growth. But with that, you're still seeing just a lot of pressure on like, I got to work on cost right now. A lot of margin is being worked on versus just top line growth. And so we see that a lot. And that's sort of, to us, that's a good thing because, it boils down to TCO and we have big TCO advantages in analytics. So, but for right now, the market space, I think, is very much efficiency oriented. I bet everyone on the call has heard this term, get more efficient, be more efficient. So I think efficiency is something we're hearing constantly from top executives, which is we don't want to pull back completely. We don't want to just say like we're anti-growth. They want to grow. They want to look at ways to innovate, but they're trying to do so under like, constrained or flat budgets. It just do more with less. And so I think those are sort of the two innovation parameters from a short term, which is like, it's very efficiency oriented, and long term is Gen AI is going to completely upend my industry. And we need we need some big picture thinking about how that's going to happen. I don't know that that's 100% trickled down into data analytics teams yet, because I don't know that the formulation of what that's going to look like has happened yet.
Yeah, great points. Again, if somebody wanted to listen to that conversation, that panel that you were talking about there, that's on the Dremio website, anything they need to do to find it?
Yep. They can go right here and go find it. Google's always your friend. Search, 2024 trends and predictions, Dremio, and you'll find the event. It'll come right up, and you can look at the content. And as always, it's on YouTube. So go to YouTube.
Awesome.
We try to do that a lot, guys. We have a bunch of content we put out consistently for data engineers and practitioners, but also data leaders. And so we have a program we run called Gnarly Data Waves, and it's just a webcast we run. We have an episode about every other week. That's on some of these like recent topics that are happening. One of the ones that's coming up a lot right now is data products. Like, what is a data product versus a data asset? How do I define that? How do I think about ownership and SLAs? And we just put a blog out about that the other day as well. So yeah, tune into those, and we hope to keep helping you out, and tell us what you need to hear about, and we'll write it. Excellent.
Well, Reed, I just want to thank you again. This has been a fascinating discussion. You guys have a great report. Really appreciate hearing about the results from that, and really appreciate your time and the update on Dremio.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.